What we're doing today is just presenting on some very preliminary findings on this Digit funded project on, oh wow, I look very big in the room at the moment. Digit funded project on the role of human resource managers in food manufacturing, and a little bit of a literature review, and also kind of, some initial findings we've had with some initial interviews we've had. So Cassie, if you could go to the next slide, please. So and I think this is great that it came after this presentation came after the presentation just before, because that was a fantastic overview and literature review of questions around HR and technology and work. And there's been a lot of debate around the impact of Industry 4.0 on work, where you've seen technologies being adopted for increasing efficiency and flexibility. And now we've got this new debate about Industry 5.0, about trying to put the worker at the center of the kind of production process when we're thinking about new technologies. And a lot of the other previous research has looked at the kind of impact of different forms of technology on skills, employment, work quality, both negative, well, overwhelmingly, I think negative in most cases of academic research, but also positive outcomes as well. But yeah, focus on there around kind of impact on skills, work intensification, things like that, but kind of individual technologies and processes being adopted. And then another strand is kind of looked at the kind of the voice involved, if there's any kind of influence or participation by employees or other actors in the adoption of these forms of technology. And what we're kind of arguing in this project is that we want a greater focus needed on the kind of temporal processes, which actually connects well with Phil's last slide that he had on, the need to kind of follow the story, look at the work processes and these kind of forms of micro negotiation. So Cassie, if we go to the next slide, please. So, sorry, I'm following it also on my computer at the same time. So to date, there's been existing kind of research on the transformation of the role of HR managers. You can trace this back to looking at the move from personnel management to HR management, David Ulrich's work and people like that. So there's been a long history of looking at the kind of role of HR managers having to adapt to changes in the nature of work and things like that. And there's also been a lot of research, as the previous presentation showed, on the evolution of individual kind of HR practices, whether it's around recruitment, training, selection, development, and their kind of digitalization, the way they're being affected by AI, for example. But we're arguing there's been kind of short shrift paid to the role of HR managers as kind of intermediaries in these technological kind of change processes. So are they being deprofessionalized, as the kind of last presentation showed? Are they given more of a role? Is their role becoming subservient to operations managers and things like that? So how are HR managers involved in those kind of work processes and in those forms of negotiation that go on when adopting different digital technologies? Next slide, please. So we're looking at this in relation to food manufacturing. So we're not really focusing here on the kind of, the lush green fields here at the west of Ireland, in this case, so the image in the top left, but what happens after the agricultural commodities leave the farm and kind of where they go into, what process they go into next. So we're kind of focusing on the food manufacturing and sort of processing end here. And this is quite a complicated, well, it can be quite a complicated process. There's some aspects are pretty simple, like cheese making, for example, but also some aspects can be really, really highly complex. For example, the creation of like infant formula, for example. So we're looking at any form of kind of food manufacturing and processing, from kind of meat packing, biscuit making, ready meals, etc. And in some cases you can, I'm sure you've got images in your mind of what a meat packing plant would look like, and you've seen those headline news as a result of COVID and the occupational safety and health impacts in that sector. But a lot of these processing plants resemble more kind of pharmaceutical laboratories than they would somewhere where a sort of carcass is disassembled. So we're focusing down particularly on these technologies. How are they being adopted in food manufacturing and processing? What's the kind of forms of negotiation? Who's involved, and what role does HR have to play in this? And particularly because, you know, the in terms of CRIMT and everything like that is about the prospects of the better and kind of good work. Next slide, please. So we're looking at this in relation to the UK and Ireland. It was just going to be the UK, and then I moved to Ireland. So now we're doing UK and Ireland. In both countries, they're the largest manufacturing sector, with large amounts of turnover involving lots and lots of people. So the kind of prospects for good and better work are quite significant. In the UK, you've got a much kind of greater focus on manufacturing processing of kind of branded products, Coca-Cola, Ribena, etc. Whereas in Ireland, you've got a much greater focus on kind of intermediary products like whey protein, for example, or ingredients or flavorings and things like that. So the batter that they put on chicken nuggets, for example, is made by Kerry in Ireland, for example. So these products that then end up in other products. So if we go to the next slide, please, Cassie. And the kind of context around digitalization is in a context of disruption, and this picks up on some of the bits that Gregor was saying in the kind of opening plenary about this kind of triple salvo of disruption that we see in this sector. There's significant labour shortages. Obviously, in relation to the UK, that's the impact of Brexit, but it's also the impact of COVID. But also that a lot of the employers we've spoken to can't even get the right people with the right skills into these jobs. So there's a labour shortage of low skilled workers, but also a shortage of those who have more higher skilled responsibilities, particularly as these companies are moving towards more digital technologies. And then you have the kind of impact of sustainability as well. And so these kind of these three things have kind of created this sort of perfect storm here, potentially for technological adoption, is trying to solve the skills crisis, the labour shortage crisis, and the kind of sustainability question. So over to you, Cassie.
Technology in the discourse within the food manufacturing industry is really seen as a panacea, a way to solve these big problems facing. And kind of to touch back on Xavier's point about kind of this tension between automation and augmentation, we really see this in the discourses around Industry 4.0 and Industry 5.0. So the first is about automating processes, and the second is about putting sort of the worker at the center of technological design. And what we see in the food manufacturing industry is a real focus because of, or a real tension between the shortage of skills and the shortage of labor, with the focus on automation. And so there's really a focus on how can they save labor, how can they automate tasks and processes in such a way that they can kind of address the labor shortage that they're facing. In such a way, and there's often a discourse around doing that in such a way that it creates better work. So automating dirty, dangerous, and routine tasks. Just to give you a sense of some of the technologies that are being implemented, I'll see if I can show this video. This is a wonderful video that demonstrates that technology is not always better when you automate processes. And one of the key things for some of the operations, for the managers that we've been speaking to around tech adoption is, can the technology do it as well as a human for the same cost or better? And so that, for the people actually implementing technology on the ground, is the key focus. So some examples of things that we've kind of been hearing about that seem to be doing that are in the top right-hand corner. You can see a machine that's been installed that automates placing sort of plastic or polystyrene containers on the conveyor belt on the food manufacturing production line. Now, if you have a human doing this job, they can place around 50 trays a minute. It's a really repetitive, routine job, just putting the tray down. With this machine, they can increase it to up to 120. The factory where I saw it in action, it was around 100. They doubled the speed. They not only replaced the person on that line, but they were able to speed up, double their productivity. And in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see robots. some firms are starting to adopt these as well, and these are, they're talking about potentially being able to replace 2 or 3 operators on the production line. So a lot of these technologies focus on automation of work. So what are our initial findings? Well, in the context of Ireland, one of the key things, the key motivators for a lot of firms in terms of technological adoption is all around health and safety. There have been a number of big scandals recently where, headlines have been made in front page newspaper around workers having fingers cut off or, being severely injured in the course of just doing their jobs. And so for one example that Hugh heard about was Tesco's has recently asked one of their major suppliers in Ireland to build a new factory, making everything as automated as possible because they don't want the reputational damage that would come from having one of these scandals emerge in the market. In the UK context, I've been to a couple of recent industry days, and there's a real focus there on how can they cope with labour and skill shortages. They physically are having to cut back on the production that they're doing. They're having lines that they're not running at their full kind of production capability. And this is at operator level, at quality assurance level, at kind of very machine minders or kind of, skilled operators who know the machines really well. At engineering levels, you're seeing big brands saying they have shifts where they don't have engineers on site. So for them, they're really focusing on how can they automate in such a way that they can increase their production back to where it should be, had they been able to recruit to the level they wanted to recruit. When we're speaking to sort of operations managers, engineering managers, and a few HR managers on the shop floor, looking at the site visits, what we're really seeing is tensions in the process of technology adoption within food manufacturing. So operations managers tend to lead this process in conjunction with engineering directors. They tend to make the plans, put in the sort of capital expenditure forms. They're making cases. It's usually at the moment because of the pressures facing a lot of firms in the UK with the energy crisis. They're focusing on 6 months return on investment, which is incredibly short. It's normally under 18 months. So I was told by one operations manager, if I can't get a return on investment in 6 months, I'm not bothering. Submit at the moment. And on top of that, HR is only really being involved in that process once the project has been approved, once the initial designs are in place, and they're kind of really being put into being involved to kind of help design the training programs or to develop kind of the recruitment ads. There's also kind of one of the things really facing a lot of operations managers is a basic skill challenge. So operators, I think one operations manager told me that of his English-speaking workforce, big reliance on migrant workers as well, 10% of those are illiterate. Of the migrant workforce, who obviously English is not their first language, some of them don't speak English, and 20% of them are illiterate. So there's a real challenge there also around basic skills and how you create better work or more highly skilled work if it's even feasible. If you have these kind of basic skill challenges of your existing workforce. And for that reason, I've been told some operations managers that have told me that it's very difficult to think about how you can create better work. It's often about how you can remove those tasks or remove workers at the operator level at least without not necessarily making their work more complicated. And there are obviously, and I think this is kind of something in the literature that's come up several times, there are other positions emerging. So between kind of your skilled operator who knows the machine, you're now seeing with robotics the need for something between that position and an engineer. So these new positions are emerging where they're going to need mechatronics skill sets, and that kind of creates challenges for these managers, both for HR but also for operations and engineering directors to try and recruit. So there's this potential for polarization in the sector that we're starting to see. So I'll end it there because I'm aware that I might be a minute or two over. But this is just the next steps. We're at the very early stages of scoping interviews. So this is very, very early finding. And obviously we've done some observations, but we'll be moving on to sort of more detailed data collection phases, 2 phases in the next 12 months, looking to produce a report to the Institute of Work next year. So if anyone has any feedback on how we can sort of strengthen the project, ask more interesting questions, we'd really appreciate it. We're at the point where we can give that feedback to make the project stronger. So thank you very much.